The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the endless stretch of desert. The air was dry and the heat was still intense, even as the day began to fade. Sarah sat on the ground, her back against a rock, trying to make sense of how she had ended up here. Her head was pounding, and her mouth felt like it was full of cotton. She could barely remember what had happened, but she knew one thing for sure. She was in trouble. It had all started in Las Vegas. Sarah had always been drawn to the bright lights and the promise of easy money. She had gone to the city with a group of friends, hoping to have a good time and maybe win a little cash. But things had quickly spiraled out of control. She had started drinking, and before she knew it, she was sitting at a blackjack table, placing bets she couldn't afford to lose. The more she drank, the more reckless she became. She had lost track of time, of money, of everything. The last thing she remembered was being approached by a man who had offered her a drink. She had taken it without thinking, and after that, everything was a blur. When she woke up, she was here, in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how she had gotten there. Her purse was gone, along with her phone and any form of identification. She was completely alone. Sarah tried to stand, but her legs were shaky, and she stumbled back to the ground. She felt weak, and her mind was still foggy. She looked around, but there was nothing but sand and rocks as far as the eye could see. She had no idea which direction to go or how far she was from the nearest town. Panic began to set in as she realized just how dire her situation was. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature began to drop rapidly. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill. She knew she couldn't stay here, but she had no idea what to do. She was miles from anywhere, with no food, no water, and no way to call for help. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced them back. She couldn't afford to break down now. Just as she was about to give up hope, she saw something in the distance. At first, she thought it might be a mirage, but as it got closer, she realized it was a car. Her heart leapt with hope as she stood up and waved her arms, trying to get the driver's attention. The car slowed down as it approached, and she saw that it was a taxi. She couldn't believe her luck. The taxi pulled up beside her, and the window rolled down. The driver was an older man with a kind face and a gentle smile. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I'm not okay. I don't know how I got here, but I need help." The man nodded and got out of the car. He opened the back door for her and helped her inside. "Don't worry, I'll take care of you," he said softly. Sarah sank into the seat, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She was safe, at least for now. As the taxi pulled away, she looked out the window at the desert landscape, wondering how she had ended up in this situation. She knew she had made some bad choices, but she never thought it would come to this. The taxi driver didn't say much as they drove, but his presence was comforting. Sarah felt like she could finally relax, knowing that she was in good hands. She closed her eyes and let herself drift off, exhausted from the ordeal. When she woke up, they were still driving, but the landscape had changed. They were no longer in the desert. Instead, they were on a highway surrounded by trees and mountains. Sarah sat up and looked around, feeling a little disoriented. "Where are we?" she asked. "We're about an hour outside of Las Vegas," the driver replied. "I thought it would be best to get you as far away from there as possible." Sarah nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. She still didn't know how she had ended up in the desert, but she was glad to be away from the city. She knew she needed to make some changes in her life, but she wasn't sure where to start. As they continued to drive, Sarah felt a sense of calm settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance to start over. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to turn her life around. The taxi driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes filled with compassion. "You've been through a lot," he said, "but you're strong. You'll get through this." Sarah smiled weakly, feeling a lump form in her throat. She didn't know what to say, but she was grateful for his words. She knew she had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. As they drove, the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape. Sarah watched as the world outside the window came to life. feeling a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was ready to make a change. The taxi continued to wind its way through the mountains, the early morning light casting long shadows across the road. Sarah sat in the back seat, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. She felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, fear, guilt, and a glimmer of hope. She knew she needed to talk to someone, and the taxi driver seemed like the only person she could trust right now. "Thank you for picking me up," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes kind and understanding. "It's no trouble," he said. "I'm just glad I was able to help." Sarah nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. She wanted to say more, but the words caught in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I don't even know how I ended up in the desert," she admitted. "The last thing I remember is being in Las Vegas at a casino. I was drinking, and I think someone drugged me." The driver's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Sympathy, maybe, or understanding. "Las Vegas can be a dangerous place," he said, "especially if you're not careful." Sarah looked down at her hands, feeling a wave of shame wash over her. "I know," she whispered. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could have a little fun, you know? But it got out of control so fast." The driver nodded, his hands steady on the wheel. "It happens to a lot of people," he said. "The casinos, the alcohol, they can make you forget who you are, but you're not alone. There are people who can help you if you're willing to ask for it." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had been so caught up in her own world, so focused on the thrill of the moment, that she hadn't stopped to think about the consequences. Now, sitting in the back of a taxi with a stranger, she realized just how far she had fallen. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've made so many mistakes, I've hurt people, I've lost so much. I don't know if I can ever fix it." The driver was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Then he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "It's never too late to change," he said. "No matter how far you've fallen, there's always a way back. But you have to want it. You have to be willing to take that first step." Sarah looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of her mistakes felt too heavy to bear. "What if I can't do it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm too weak?" The driver's eyes met hers in the mirror, and for a moment she felt like he could see straight into her soul. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "You've already survived more than most people could handle. But you don't have to do it alone. There are people who care about you, who want to help you. You just have to let them in." Sarah felt a tear slide down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She had been running from her problems for so long, hiding behind alcohol and gambling, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly honest with herself. But now, sitting in the back of this taxi, she felt like she was finally facing the truth. "I don't want to live like this anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I want to change, I want to be better, but I don't know how." The driver smiled gently, his eyes filled with compassion. "The first step is admitting that you need help," he said, "and you've already done that. The rest will come in time. Just take it one day at a time." Sarah nodded, feeling a small spark of hope ignite in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to try. As they drove, the conversation turned to lighter topics. The driver told her about his life, about the people he had met and the places he had been. He spoke with a quiet wisdom that made Sarah feel like she was in the presence of someone who had seen it all. She found herself opening up to him in a way she hadn't with anyone else, sharing things she had kept buried deep inside. But there was one question that kept nagging at her, one thing she couldn't quite let go of. "Why did you stop for me?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "I mean, you didn't have to. You could have just driven by." The driver was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road. Then he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Sometimes people need a little help," he said. "And sometimes It's our job to be there for them. You were lost, and I could see that. I couldn't just leave you there." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat and she looked away, trying to hide the tears that were welling up in her eyes. She didn't know what to say, but she felt a deep sense of gratitude for this man who had shown her such kindness. As they continued to drive, the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the landscape. Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. The taxi pulled up in front of Sarah's house just as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the quiet neighborhood. Sarah sat in the back seat, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. She had been through so much in the past 24 hours, and now, finally, she was home. The driver turned off the engine and looked at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes kind and understanding. "We're here," he said softly. Sarah nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to leave the safety of the taxi, but she knew she had to. She took a deep breath and reached for the door handle, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." The driver smiled gently, his eyes filled with compassion. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "Just remember that. You have the power to change your life, but it's up to you to take that first step." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she forced herself to smile. She knew he was right, but the thought of facing her problems head-on was still terrifying. She had spent so long running from them, hiding behind alcohol and gambling, that she wasn't sure she knew how to stop. "I'll try," she said, her voice trembling. "I promise." The driver nodded, his expression serious. "That's all anyone can ask," he said. "Just take it one day at a time, and remember, you're not alone. There are people who care about you, who want to help you. You just have to let them in." Sarah felt a tear slide down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She knew he was right, but the thought of opening up to someone, of being vulnerable, was still so hard. She had spent so long building walls around herself, trying to protect herself from getting hurt, that she wasn't sure she knew how to let them down. "I will," she said, her voice breaking. "I promise." The driver smiled gently, his eyes filled with compassion. "I know you will," he said. "Just remember, it's never too late to change. No matter how far you've fallen, there's always a way back." Sarah nodded, feeling a small spark of hope ignite in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to try. She opened the door and stepped out of the taxi, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She turned back to the driver, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you," she said again, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." The driver nodded, his eyes kind and understanding. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. "And remember, you're not alone." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced herself to smile. She knew he was right, but the thought of facing her problems head-on was still terrifying. She had spent so long running from them, hiding behind alcohol and gambling, that she wasn't sure she knew how to stop. "I will," she said, her voice trembling. "I promise." The driver smiled gently, his eyes filled with compassion. "I know you will," he said. "Just remember, it's never too late to change. No matter how far you've fallen, there's always a way back." Sarah nodded, feeling a small spark of hope ignite in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to try. She closed the door and took a step back, watching as the taxi pulled away from the curb. She stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest as the car disappeared down the street. She felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. As she turned to walk up the path to her house, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She looked back at the street, but the taxi was gone. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. Sarah stood there for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. She didn't know what to think, but she knew one thing for sure. She had been given a second chance. She took a deep breath and turned to walk up the path to her house, her mind racing with thoughts of everything that had happened. She knew she had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. As she reached the front door, she paused and looked back at the street one last time. The taxi was gone, but the memory of the driver's kind eyes and gentle smile lingered in her mind. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had shown her such kindness, and she knew that she would never forget him. She opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar surroundings of her home bringing a sense of comfort and safety. She knew she had a lot of work to do, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. As she closed the door behind her, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was ready to make a change. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The events of the past 24 hours felt like a blur, but one thing was clear. She had been given a second chance. She knew she couldn't waste it. She thought back to the conversation she had with the taxi driver, his words echoing in her mind. "You're stronger than you think," he had said. "Just take it one day at a time." Sarah knew he was right, but the thought of facing her problems head-on was still terrifying. She had spent so long running from them, hiding behind alcohol and gambling, that she wasn't sure she knew how to stop. She took a deep breath and stood up, feeling a sense of determination settle over her. She knew she couldn't do this alone, but she also knew that she had to take the first step. She walked over to her desk and pulled out a notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. She sat down and began to write, her hand trembling slightly as she put pen to paper. She wrote about everything that had happened, about the mistakes she had made and the pain she had caused. She wrote about the fear and the guilt that had been weighing her down, and about the hope that had been sparked by the kindness of a stranger. As she wrote, she felt a sense of release, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She knew she had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. When she was finished, she closed the notebook and sat back, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. She knew she had a lot of work to do, but she was ready to face it. She stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The sun had set, and the neighborhood was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. She felt a sense of peace come over her, as if she were home at last. Sarah knew that life would not give her easy answers, but she also understood that she had a chance to rewrite her story. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was in control, and with that came the determination to never lose herself again. If you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and drop a comment below letting us know where you're listening from. It helps this channel grow more than you know. Have a nice day.